Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Kuan School of Public Policy. My job is very simple, to introduce the speaker. But I realized the first thing to do is to make the crowd a bit happy. So I'm pleased to inform you that at the end of the talk at 6:30, you've all been specially selected to attend a wine and cheese reception. It's only for very special people. And it will be held at the Space Bank. If you just come out, they'll guide you and show you the way to go there. So whatever you do, don't rush home after the lecture. Now, the other point I learned from my guru, Ambassador Tomiko, is that when he says whenever you stand up and speak, just make 3 points and then shut up. So I'll make 3 points. The first point, of course, is that I never miss an opportunity to put in a commercial for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and to say how it is, by the way, in case you didn't know, this is the best school of public policy in Singapore. Now, don't say it's the only school of public policy, okay? It may also be the best school of public policy in Southeast Asia. But actually, the school is doing remarkably well. It's growing very fast, fastest growing school of public policy. Enrollment is quadrupled in the first 3.5 years. It's the first Asian school of public policy to join the Global Public Policy Network. We've also been admitted. We also have students from all over the world. Only 20% of our students come from Singapore, 80% come from the rest of the world. So we've had a remarkable trajectory. And the most recent good news, by the way, is that the Institute of Policy Studies has just joined our school. They joined us on 1st January. In fact, we gave them a welcome party in our school a few days ago. And we hope in due course to move them physically also to the Bukit Timah campus here. If all goes well, they're going to move into a building called House Number 5 on Bukit Timah campus. And the good news is that the House Number 5 used to be the economics department of the former University of Singapore. And that's where SM Goh Chok Tong studied economics, where Dana Balan studied economics, where Ngiam Tong Dao studied economics. So it's a very appropriate home for the Institute of Policy Studies to come. So you reconnect back spiritually to the roots of this campus here. But the reason why, there are many reasons why our school has done well, but one critical reason why it's done well is because we inherited a public policy program that was launched way back in 1991-92 in partnership with the Kennedy School of Government of Harvard University. And it is basically this, now I guess almost 16, 17-year partnership that has explained the growth of the school and the program. And it is in some ways the reason why we today benefiting from the presence of Professor Altshuler, because it is this partnership that has brought him here. In fact, we would have had him, Alan, as you know, 3 years ago, but Larry Summers stole him, took him to make him Dean of the School of Design, and that's why he came 3 years later, but we're glad he's here. Now, for my second point, let me say just a quick word about our speaker. As you all know, he's had a very distinguished career. He has a PhD from Chicago. He's been a professor of political science at MIT. Equally importantly, he's worked in government. He worked as Massachusetts Secretary of Transportation and Construction. I'm pleased to inform you that in 1974, he was named by Time magazine as 200 in the 200 Faces for the Future, and clearly he lived up to that promise. He's also been Dean of the New York University's Graduate School of Public Administration, and since 1988, for the last 20 years, he's been in Harvard, where he also served as Academic Dean, and as I mentioned earlier, Dean of the School of Design also. But I can give you all the facts, basic facts about Alan's illustrious career, but none of the facts will capture what is really special about him. Because having got to know him, I can say that, as I get older, I've come to realize that there's a big difference between intelligence, knowledge, and wisdom. I've met many intelligent and knowledgeable people who are not very wise. Actually, in the case of Altshuler, I can honestly say he's one of the wisest people I've met, and I think you will discover this in the course of his lecture. And this is why it's a very special treat to have Alan here with us. Now, my final point is about the topic. Now, clearly, I'm not an urban planner. I'm not going to say anything about cities, but I'm going to comment on one remarkable thing. One of the great things about, whether you notice one reason why I'm keeping on talking is that as I keep watching the people coming in, when the stream stops, I stop speaking. No, seriously, my last point. It's actually one of the great things about American academic discourse is how you can say anything you want, you know. You can say politically incorrect things. I mean, I remember when I visited Harvard last year, I believe, I went there, I went to the Kennedy School, and I gave a talk, and the topic I chose, which is of course a politically incorrect one, was why Western incompetence is the greatest threat to the world today. And some of you will notice I've written a book about the subject now. But you can do that in a Western academic environment. And in some ways it's great that Alan Altshuler can speak very candidly about lessons not to learn from American cities. Someday I hope we'll get a Singaporean to come up here and give a lecture on lessons not to learn from Singapore. That's the future. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Kishore, for that wonderful introduction. If I'm demonstrating my wisdom today, it's by not trying to advise Singapore, but rather talking about what I know. I hope you'll bear with me a little bit today. Kishore has been giving me such a wonderful time. I've been seeing so many people, going so many places, that I managed to pick up a cold a couple of days ago. And my voice is not all that it might be. So I have a mic here. I'm going to talk relatively softly into this mic, and hopefully you will all be able to hear me. It would be nice not to talk about the lessons not to learn from American cities, but in fact, as one looks in global context, one realizes that the United States has gotten itself into something of a bind with respect to the pattern of its urban development. It is not organized for rational planning in the way that Singapore is, and so it's extraordinarily difficult to deal with these problems. And I thought that it might be worth discussing, in part because it'd be interesting for you to think a little bit about a place that is, in planning terms, maybe the antithesis of Singapore, but also because American urban problems are actually today more a problem for the world than they are for the United States. And I'll explain that in just a moment. Okay. So, wow, that's pretty, better not try to look at that. Obviously, there's immense variety across the world, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that variety. But if one thinks about that variety, the United States really stands at one end of the world spectrum in a number of ways. In terms of the low density of its cities, in terms of the dominance of the automobile, as opposed to even to other forms of motor vehicle transportation, in terms of its capitalist model of urban development, the extremity of its capitalist model. Cities all over the world, even in China today, are largely being developed for profit. But American cities have been developed overwhelmingly for profit. In most cases, they were developed for profit for a long time before the most rudimentary kind of planning was imposed upon them. And even today, government plays a very secondary role in the planning of American cities. One of the reasons it does so is that local government itself is so fragmented. in the United States. And of course we have a multi-level government, so local governments don't have that much power to begin with. And then they're fragmented within metropolitan areas. There are over 2,100 governments in the New York metropolitan area alone, 2,100 governments. And of those, about 1,000 have land use authority. There are also school districts and other kinds of special authorities. And you might think, well, all right, so local government is fragmented, but there must be a lot of guidance from higher levels of government. Well, the answer is the higher levels of government do some very important things, not just internationally, but even domestically. They built our interstate highway system, for example. They manage, they provide financial aid for all kinds of infrastructure development. But the national government has never had land use goals for American cities. The national government doesn't talk much or issue directives about urban development. Somebody wrote not too many weeks ago that in the presidential debates that are going on right now, not a single one of the 15 or so candidates in the two parties has discussed urban policy. So this is not a central dimension of national politics in the United States. So the consequences that matter about this are, I think, first and foremost to the world, that American cities use up about 6 times as much energy per capita as cities worldwide. This is based on comparisons of cities over 500,000 in population. And likewise emit greenhouse gases at about the same rate. And if you compare them to Asia, it's about 8 times the comparison. If one thinks about Asia with more than half the world's population ever reaching American standards of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, we're in deep trouble, and Singapore is deep underwater at that point. The United States, not only as a result of its urban transportation patterns, but because it's had great difficulty formulating an energy policy of any sort that really matters in terms of energy demand, is today 2/3 dependent on foreign oil, whereas at the time of the oil shock in 1973, it was only 1/3 dependent, and there was a great flurry of activity for years about making the United States energy independent. But as you can see, we haven't exactly made progress in that direction. As a result of our extraordinary dependency on foreign oil, we have these nearly $1 trillion a year balance of payments deficits. I mean, that's hard to imagine. Actually, it's 700 or 800 billion, not quite $1 trillion. 700 or 800 billion American dollars. If you think Singapore dollars, it's more than $1 trillion a year deficit, piling up year after year. The dollar, of course, is declining in value, which those of us who travel the world notice particularly. There are international tensions. We've fought 2 wars in the Middle East, largely over oil, in the past 16, 17 years. The United States spends more on military power than the next 20 nations in the world combined. I don't think we really have to do so, but it's in large part because of the sense of insecurity around energy. And, of course, within our cities, notice that I come to this 5th in this series of points. Within our cities, there is indeed rising congestion, rising travel times, and rising costs. But, you know, those are relatively minor effects. And, in fact, travel times are only up, for commutation, for example, a couple of minutes per day for the average commuter relative to where they were in 1960 and 1970. So, in fact, that's a relatively trivial problem. And it helps to explain why change is so hard, but I'm going to have much more to say about why change is so hard. So, let's look at some sample regions around the world. These figures, I should note, are approximate. They're based on UN data and national census data, but they are the best, come from the best compilation of over 1,000 cities that I have been able to come across. So if you look at the first 5 of these cities, they're all low-income cities of Asia and North Africa. And notice they're all in the range of 10,000 to 26,000 people per square kilometer in their continuous built-up area. Then we have two high-income Asian cities, which are quite dense, but not nearly as dense as these very low-income cities. Then we come to cities of Western Europe, 5 of them, all in the range of 3,400 to 5,100 people per square kilometer. And then we come to the great American cities. Los Angeles, amazingly, when you look at it as a region, is the densest American region. We tend to think about it as the most sprawling American region. It's actually the densest American region when you include the suburbs, along with the city, but only at 2,400 people per square kilometer. And then in this sample, going down to Atlanta, which represents the most auto-dependent American cities, at only 700 people per square kilometer. Extraordinarily low density. So now we'll look at a few pictures. So Mumbai, there's some high-rise here, but it's mainly that people are just living cheek by jowl in relatively low-density settings. Fez, similar situation. I showed a street with no cars on it. It's not, automobile transportation is not very central here. Hanoi, which many of you, I'm sure, know well. Extraordinary density, not high-rise. You don't have to have high-rise to have high density. Lagos, actually not North Africa, but Africa. Extraordinarily high density. These streets give some sense of it, but without that tremendous amount of high-rise activity. Seoul, as we get into higher income Asia, there's more, oops, sorry, we're not, Seoul, we see more of a high-rise pattern, a neater, more planned, somewhat more planned pattern. Also quite a bit of crowding, as we can see, another picture of Seoul. Oops, we passed over Singapore. How can we do that? Here we have this is the most planned picture that we are going to see. Not all of it we know is quite as neat and planned as this, but Singapore is an example of high density with extraordinarily rational planning in a high income, relatively high income city. I don't want to spend much time on these pictures, but as we look at the European examples, what we see is not a lot of high-rise development. These are dense, relatively planned cities, but not primarily because of high-rise. Typical patterns, 5, 6, 7-story buildings, but built right up against each other, right up to the street. Very attractive cities, most of us think, as we go to visit them, but not super high density by world standards. I do this mainly to introduce you to the pictures of the American cities. So here's Los Angeles, the most dense American high-income city, a narrow spine of some high-rise buildings, but people mainly live at 1 and 2 stories in Los Angeles. They're filling it in. There are more 4 and 5-story buildings in Los Angeles today because they're up against the mountains and the sea. They can't just infinitely expand, but amazingly low rise. Here's a more familiar picture of Los Angeles and the way in which it handles its cars. New York is the really amazing one because we have this high-density image here and here, but there's tremendous area of low-density suburb outside, and that's how the entire region comes back. I have another slide a little bit later. We'll talk about the difference between the various parts of the New York region, but it's astonishing that the entire region, at least as defined by the United States, is so low density. Chicago, same thing, a high-rise core, but extraordinarily low-density suburbs, and it just goes on and on. Phoenix, even lower density, and lots of open space, as you can see. Extraordinarily vast area. More of Phoenix. Sun City is outside of Phoenix. It's a suburb that's been a planned suburb mainly for people over 55 years of age. Houston, again, these cities just go on and on with people living basically at ground level and with lots of land around at least large numbers of the housing. And finally, Atlanta, with all of these highways, a little bit of high-rise in the center, but amazingly only 700 people per square kilometer. Now, within the United States, there's tremendous diversity, too. Turning from regions to central cities, as I do in this slide, you get a little sense of this diversity. I thought I'd particularly point out the diversity within the New York region. So Manhattan is about the same density as Mumbai and Hong Kong, much higher density than Singapore. New York City is about the same density as Singapore. But the New York region, as you see, is about less than a quarter the density of Singapore. Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, the central cities are in some cases moderately high density, but they're surrounded by extraordinarily low density suburbs. And then we get out to Atlanta, where the central city is even lower density when you take everything into account than its suburbs are. Quite astonishing. So one of the things one might expect is that, there's a very interesting article by two Australian scholars, Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy, who are called 10 Myths about Automobile Dependence. And one of these myths is that automobile dependence is a function largely of income. That as people get richer, they want cars, they get cars. In fact, there's extraordinary variety across the world when you hold income relatively constant. And so the most interesting part, I think, of this slide is that when one compares the United States, the Western European Union, and high-income Asia. Now, this is a sample of 84 cities, and we're looking at a limited number of cities in each of these categories. This is a study that Kenworthy carried out in the early part of this decade. So high-income Asia is Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Taipei, Osaka, and Sapporo in this sample. But notice that the United States, Western European Union, high-income Asia, at least by international purchasing power parity comparisons, have roughly similar incomes, but such extraordinary differences in terms of usage and dependence on the automobile. It may not be obvious to everybody what passenger kilometers per capita means, because the Straits Times had an error about that this morning. But what it means is how many kilometers per year, per capita, do people travel by automobile. And as you can see, in high-income Asia, it's about 1/5 the level in the United States, which may help to explain why it is that greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption is 5 or 6 times higher in the United States. Low-income Asia, of course, only about half the level of passenger kilometers per capita as high-income Asia, and China, coming along fast, as of about 2000, in any event, was vastly lower than that. If we look at the mode split among various ways of traveling, just compare the United States and China in this. So 89% of all trips by car in the United States. This doesn't include walking trips, but it includes, well, it does include walking trips. There's a low threshold, I forget what it is, but it does include walking trips. But 89% by car in the United States, only 3% by public motorized transportation, and only 8% by walking in the United States. In China, on the other hand, 65% by non-motorized transportation, only 16% by motor vehicle. So we have something to look forward to as low-income Asia develops and becomes like high-income Asia, we have to hope, not like high-income United States. Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking, I lost track of where we were. Wait a second. All right. So if we look at emissions and energy use in 1995, these figures are, you get some of these figures that I was talking about before. So United States, energy use nearly 6 times high-income Asia, and greenhouse gas emissions about 5 times, a little more than 5 times high-income Asia. And again, if we look at where China was in 1995, extraordinarily low, which is rather striking since China accounts for more growth in energy demand in recent years than even the United States does. And greenhouse gas emissions, it may be, according to some analyses, greenhouse gas emissions are rising in absolute terms faster in China, more in China per year than any other country in the world. So when you have 1.3 billion people, even from a low base, you can make extraordinary contributions to world energy demand and to world greenhouse gas emissions. So let's turn to back to the United States again and talk a little bit about what shaped the American pattern and why it's so difficult to change the American pattern. It's fairly simple as one thinks about it. The United States has this extraordinarily vast land area. That doesn't explain everything. Sweden, for example, has a vast land area compared to its population, but it also has very dense cities and very high transit usage. But it also has a high orientation toward planning of how its cities develop. But in any event, the United States was not under any imperative to produce dense cities. As I mentioned before, the extraordinary national commitment to private property and to profit-driven development in the United States. But then one also has to look at the economic factors that prevailed early in this century as the American pattern really developed. As late as 1950, the United States produced 85% of the cars in the United States. I saw a figure today. In 1960, 92% of the motor vehicles in the world were in the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and nowhere in Asia in 1960. Asia accounted for 1% of the motor vehicle population of the world in 1960. That's how fast things developed. But by 1960, the American pattern of urban development and of land use was well established and extraordinarily difficult to change. In addition to that, the United States was self-sufficient in oil till the 1960s. So here we are, vast land area, the greatest producer of automobiles in the world, not only producing all of its own, but exporting automobiles. Self-sufficient in oil. You say, well, why shouldn't you have an automobile-oriented society? Nobody was sensitive to environmental problems at that point. Nobody had heard of greenhouse gases at that point. So the vast majority of the American urbanized area has developed in the auto age, at a time when the United States was not in the least disposed toward restraining the development of this auto-dependent mode of life, and in which its greatest industries were oriented toward promoting it. One of the earliest studies I did many years ago, back in the 1960s, I hate to admit I'm not old, but anyway, in the 1960s is when I did it, looking at the 10 largest companies in the United States. 9 out of 10 of them were automobile or oil companies. And the 10th was DuPont, which at that time owned 24% of General Motors, was later forced in by an antitrust suit to divest itself of that. The United States was also the richest country in the world, so its population was better able to afford the costs of automobility and low density. It is a relatively expensive lifestyle. It's not a super expensive lifestyle because, in fact, people who own their own homes take care of them. They don't have paid staff to take care of their homes. If they drive their cars, they don't have to worry about paid people driving public transit vehicles and maintaining those vehicles. They do a lot of the maintenance of their vehicles themselves. It's extraordinarily expensive in land terms. It is overall somewhat more expensive than a high-density, well-managed system, but the Americans could afford it better than anybody else in the world could afford it at this point. Not surprisingly, as a result, we had public policies that accommodated and tended to promote this system as well. And in the early post-war period, probably the two most important of these were building vast amounts of highway infrastructure, with the federal government becoming more active than it had been in virtually any other domestic policy area throughout its history, certainly involving the physical development of the country, except the development of the railroads in the 19th century, where the strategy was to grant land to the railroads, not to grant cash, but to grant land to the railroads in return for their commitment to build them. And a second strategy was a strategy which we've been very proud of for many years. We're less proud of it now, given the subprime mortgage crisis. But America has pioneered for much of the world in providing low-cost mortgage opportunities for people to own their own homes. Singapore has done this one better, but the United States, in the last 40 years, but going back to the 1940s, the United States pioneered in this way and had programs that made it vastly easier for people to buy homes, and had the federal government deeply involved in establishing easy mortgage credit. What happened is, of course, in our enthusiasm for private enterprise, we have allowed the banks to sometimes become too loose in their lending practices, too easy in their lending practices, because there are big profits to be made by doing so. And we've now created a subprime crisis, which the best economists estimate is probably going to cost $500 to $600 billion of write-downs by investors across the world. If we continue with this, I've talked about the decentralized pattern of American urban governments, the fact that local governments in the United States, because of their tax structures and so on, are fierce competitors for private investment. The weak oversight by higher levels I've talked about. The fact I haven't mentioned is that for a variety of reasons, poverty and crime tend to be concentrated in the United States in the older portions of our central cities, and there has been a pattern for people to try to escape that, and for developers to try to escape that. It's also true that Americans tend to discover planning when areas are already highly developed and have become reasonably dense. They discover planning then because when people live at high densities, they're aware of the side effects of their behavior, they're not so aware of the side effects of their behavior. They're aware of the side effects of their neighbor's behavior on them. And they begin to call for government action to deal with it, and eventually collective action becomes more significant than it was when they were living at extraordinarily low densities. So it tends to be true in American urban areas that the regulations are much more stringent in the older areas than they are out in the countryside, where developers can build what they would like to build with very little constraint until after they have developed, and then the residents begin to demand some planning so for future regulation, future development will be regulated. In any event, all of these factors together tend to accentuate sprawl. If we just think about the comparison with other parts of the world, particularly with Western Europe and high-income Asia, which are the most obvious comparisons in this sense. Western Europe, Japan, Singapore, and other places, most other places in Asia, have always imported their oil, and so their governments have had much more reason than the United States did during the buildup of the American urban pattern to restrain oil consumption. You know, today, if you look at oil-producing nations, they often have extraordinarily low oil prices. In Venezuela, not long ago, gasoline was selling for about 10 American cents per gallon. In Iran, it was selling for about 30 cents a gallon. So even today, those that feel they have oil to burn, as it were, tend to favor their own constituents in ways that really are very counterproductive for their own development and their own best use of the resource that they've been blessed with. But in any event, countries that don't have oil have always tried to restrain oil imports, viewed this as a major balance of payments issue. And, of course, countries that don't have automobile industries also view automobile imports as a balance of payments issue. So that if one looks at these countries, most of them, until fairly recently at least, have worried about both imports of cars and imports of oil, and have therefore had strong motivation to develop policies to restrain that. As a result, of course, we see very heavy public investment, not in accommodating the kind of low-density private housing that the United States is concentrated on, but rather multifamily housing, mass transit, and so on. I should say that the major American public housing finance programs until the 1960s actually redlined or basically refused to have federal participation in loans in the central cities because they viewed the central cities as declining, and they viewed these as dangerous loans. They had imported this view from the private banking sector. Another factor that tended to drive development out into the suburbs. And government, but rather than having an independent view of this matter or a policy to try to revive the central cities, rather hired private bankers to run the public housing lending programs who applied the principles that they had learned in the private banking industry. The Japanese, at least until recently, were unique in that they had a major auto industry, very high levels of auto ownership, not relative to the United States, but relative to Western Europe. They're almost as high as Western Europe in their levels of auto ownership today, yet modest auto usage. People who've analyzed this have said, well, it's because the congestion is so great, the cost of parking is so great, there are restraints on even on auto ownership that in cities like Tokyo, the biggest cities, you are required to have an off-street parking space before you can buy a car, which is similar to the requirement to have an import license to buy a car here. Japan has shown that even a country, a high-density country with fairly strong imperatives, as Japan has had, particularly with respect to oil, can restrain auto usage even as mass auto ownership comes about. So here we come to the big question. The United States consuming 25% of the world's oil with only 5% of the population, and having this enormous greenhouse gas effect, why doesn't it simply adapt? Well, I suppose in any society, patterns are difficult to change once they get established, but they're particularly difficult to change in a society with highly competitive democratic politics, with a system in which capitalism is still driving most of urban development, and in which big money plays such a large role, that is industrial money, plays such a large role in our elections, which means that the industries which are still making vast profits out of the American development scheme, selling the cars, selling the oil, servicing the cars, providing the oil out on the streets, all the law firms, the engineering firms, the other professional firms that make money out of this. It's an incredible proportion of the American economy, and it's all oriented toward business as usual, all extraordinarily reluctant to have the government step in to try to change it. Popular attitudes and lifestyles are such that there's an instant response when politicians propose, for example, an increase in the gasoline tax or other strategies to try to restrain automobile usage. The media usually jump on these proposals and seek out all the people who will be inconvenienced, all the poor people who will have difficulties as a result of this, and the public gets mad, and politicians run away from this as fast as they possibly can. The idea of raising the gas tax, which would be, of course, the most efficient way to reduce American energy demand over a relatively short period of time is viewed as so impossible that when President Carter, as the first piece of legislation he submitted after being elected president in 1976, he took office in 1977, the first piece of legislation he sent up was strong energy legislation that provided for a gradual increase in energy taxes over a 10-year period, gradual so that people could adjust to it. Not a single member of Congress would sponsor this legislation. Not a single committee in the Congress would hold hearings on this legislation. It just sank like a rock in a lake. I mean, nobody ever heard any more of this legislation. And to this very day, no politician will talk about such policies. Well, I've talked enough about the general nature of American politics. So let me come to some closing questions. First, do the differences matter? Well, they clearly do matter in terms of global warming, energy prices, Middle East tensions, military costs, the risks of war. Not so much the domestic reasons. Americans are very happy with their lifestyle. They like their single-family homes. They like having land around their homes. They love their cars. Every adult likes to have a car. Some like to have 2 or 3. Rich people, you often read about their hobby is they have 20 or 30 cars in a great garage somewhere. So Americans are not about to change this because their tastes are changing. There has to be some powerful imperative from the outside to lead the Americans to change. Is the United States resistance to change absolutely immutable? I don't think so. I don't think so. But it's going to be very difficult to bring it about. There is, in fact, great ferment in the United States today about global warming. It hasn't reached the scale that the great environmental wave of the late 60s and early 1970s had in the United States, but it's moving in that direction, just as it is moving around the world. There's much less response on the energy front. Americans are much less sensitive to energy issues on a worldwide basis because they can see that energy prices may rise, but they don't fully grasp, very few people fully grasp that we're not just paying energy costs, but we're paying all these military costs, and that we're increasing world tensions, while contributing to the increase of world tensions around oil as well. So change will require both a social movement and a major electoral upheaval. That is not impossible. It could even happen this year. It would require, because of the characteristics of American politics that enable minorities to veto change, to veto strong action. It's the fragmentation of power and the norms built into many of our institutions that enable minorities to block action. So we have what political scientists call veto group politics in the United States. A minority can often veto preferences of the majority. Vast majorities in the United States, for example, favor gun control, but the gun control interests can block action on gun control. There are many other areas where there are very large majorities, as indicated by polls at least, that favor action, but the status quo rules because we can't make change. It's interesting because the United States is such a dynamic, innovative economy in its private sector. We're extraordinarily open to change in the private sector, but it's very difficult to change public policies. In this case, it's conceivable that policy will change, but probably not at a rate that the world needs or that the world would like to see American policy change. If we go to change, obviously there are many things that can happen technologically. There are public investments we can make, although I've done analyses and many others have done analyses that show that mass transit investment by itself will not do anything to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. We can talk about that in the question period if you doubt it. With powerful financial incentives, we could bring about great change. And this can only really take two forms. It'll have to mean very large increases in energy or carbon taxes, or it could mean cap and trade systems where the government sets regulatory limits on the amount of energy that industries can consume and their products can consume. And the same thing with greenhouse gas emissions, and allows industries to trade the permits in this. Western Europe has actually moved in this direction already. It has a greenhouse gas cap and trade system, still relatively weak, but being ratcheted up, and people hope it'll ratchet up very rapidly in the next few years. But these are, of course, the hardest of all politically. Is it possible that global emissions trading could bring the United States into the fold? One can imagine international negotiations that might do that. If we had an administration that recognized that global warming was real, I guess the Bush administration in the last year has begun to admit that global warming may be a real phenomenon, but one that takes it very seriously and wants to engage in international negotiations and international treaties post-Kyoto, one could imagine a global cap and trade system getting underway, although to implement it, to administer it, will be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. There is one bit of good news, and that is that as of 1970, there were a variety of air pollutants that people had become extraordinarily concerned about. These were mainly nitrous oxides, the precursors of smog, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, lead in fuel, particulates. And the United States has made incredible progress in the period since, building on legislation that was passed in the early 1970s. We have reduced some of these, most of these pollutants by 95 to 99% in a 38-year period. So the question is, could the same thing happen with greenhouse gas emissions? Hard to imagine right now, but in 1969, it was impossible to imagine that we would make so much progress on cleaning up the emissions that people were concerned about at that time. There has even been the first bit of energy legislation passed in many years in 2007, but unfortunately it's a weak piece of legislation, so I wouldn't expect too much from that, but it is the beginning. There was a great battle over it, and there were many people in Congress, many legislators, who were pushing for much stronger legislation. And had the president favored it, there could have been much stronger legislation this year. So a president who favors it with a Congress that's similar to the present Congress or significantly more democratic than the present Congress could adopt strong energy legislation within the next several years. So how do we think about this in global terms? So we have China and India with about 2.4 billion people between them, each of which has made motor vehicle production a lead industry in its economic development planning. We have Mr. Tata and Tata Industries, which has just introduced a car for the masses in India at roughly 2,500 American dollars, I guess about 4,000 Singapore dollars. India and China are now about where the United States was in 1915 in its automobile development. These are based on numbers several years old, but nonetheless, that's where they were. That's what most of the studies we read are based on. The United States rates are about 30 times higher than that right now as automobile ownership per 1,000 people. And so we say, well, all right, what happens if India, China, and the rest of low-income Asia follow in that direction? Well, at very least, we have to hope that they follow the models of high-income Asia, places like Singapore and Tokyo, rather than moving in the directions of the models of the United States. That will somewhat mitigate the disaster in terms of world energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions that would be associated with it, but it is still going to be a great strain on the resources of the world, and the capacity of the world, particularly in the field of energy, of emissions, to come up with treaties and technologies to reduce the emissions that are associated with any given level of motor vehicle usage. Can we imagine negotiating a world system that will do this at any time in the next 10, 20, or 30 years? I should call Keisha up to the podium to give a lecture on that. I don't know the answer to that question. But clearly it's the great challenge that we face, along with the challenge that the United States, along with those countries which are developing most rapidly at this point and whose people desperately want access to motor vehicles and to the convenience that motor vehicles can provide, at least when they're not totally bogged down in traffic, to some degree it's going to be necessary to accommodate those desires, and the question is how to do it within the limits of world resources and without provoking enormous conflicts around the world. So let me stop there, and maybe we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I think we now need to start a new course in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It will be called Urban Policy and Geopolitics. I had no idea that they would be so closely linked together. The floor is now open for questions. I was going to ask the first question, but since somebody is ready, please go ahead. Please identify yourself, go to the mic, identify yourself, ask a short, sharp, and a provocative question.
Yes, this is going to be provocative because it provides answers and not just giving questions. I think you mentioned about cities, but most important part is about energy. Because energy is the core of the future of civilization, which integrate people. Transport is very important. When Susan Hopfield of MIT came to Singapore, or at her inauguration, she says she wants to solve energy problem. I told my bosses here in Singapore as well as yours, she cannot solve it because you need two opportunities to solve it. One of them is a philosophical understanding, the other one is God-sent chances. So MIT cannot solve the energy problem. How to solve it? There is a solution. The solution is not to burn whiskey to drive a ton of steel to move a person. You must use agricultural product, the best grade for human food, the second grade for feedstock for industrial and cattle feed, the third grade for packaging. Those that you cannot use, you pass out, use for energy. This has been reflected to EDB, and EDB do not use renewable energy anymore. It is using sustainable energy. This has been reflected to central government of China, and they enacted a law to prohibit the conversion of food, the best of food, for energy.
Yeah,
this is the way to go.
Yeah, I know, but I felt I had to ask you to ask a question.
Yes.
Because if everyone stands up and gives a lecture,
because not everyone can give them solutions. And this is a solution is very important.
I will be happy to invite you back to the school one day to give a lecture.
As well as Kennedy School.
I know.
Thank you.
Can you please just, if you have a question...
I think that is very important for us to solve the question. Okay. The problem. Yes, right.
I think we understand.
Yes, right.
I think
okay.
I understand what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah. I think that is a possible solution. And the question is, would you invite me to go to Kennedy to give a school of thoughts, a talk on how Oriental wisdom can solve the Occidental incompetence?
Did teacher put you up to that question? I think that the issue of using agricultural product to produce energy is an issue of growing controversy in the world, and and in the United States as well. The problem is that if we prohibit the use of food for energy, which may be a good idea, it doesn't solve the energy problem, it just reduces the amount of energy. So it may be that it's more important to use agricultural products for food and feedstock and so on, but that still leaves us with the energy problem. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody is going to solve the energy problem in the near future. One of the problems is that every new source of energy carries its own terrors. So we have nuclear energy, which is easily transmutable into nuclear weapons, and we don't know what to do with the nuclear waste. But it doesn't produce greenhouse gases. We have food stock energy, which is driving up the price of food in many parts of the world, and even the United States has taken serious note of this, but we have a tremendously powerful ethanol lobby, and corn lobby, by the way, which likes the fact that corn prices are going up, and which has been driving this policy. So there are many issues, but no easy answers.
Thank you. The next question, please. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Again, I should ask you to identify yourself, and then I'll pose the question, please.
Yeah, my name is Michael Chua. I raise financings for projects. I'm actually going to ask a question, so it's easy. Do you think that PRTs will solve some of the problems in urban planning? PRT stands for Personalized Rapid Transit, which is a compromise between a car and a public transport. It's kind of an auto-guided car on rails and so on. Thank you.
I think PRT has specialized applications that are valuable. We see them in airports all over the world. Now, I gather that Singapore has made some use of PRT as well. The problem is that fixed guideway transit, all kinds of fixed guideway transit, have the problem that they're inflexible. If you have people moving from one high-density place to another high-density place, and the traffic is great along the corridor, fixed guideway transit works extraordinarily well. So it works very well in very high-density cities. The problem is that you would like more density rather than less, rather more flexibility rather than less. PRT has the advantage of being a simple technology, not always so cheap to build, but a simple technology. But it's less flexible than some other kinds, even of rapid transit. So I think one has to, it's a technical judgment in particular circumstances whether PRT is the right answer. I don't think it's going to be the answer to most of the world's urban problems.
Thank you. Anne?
Anne Florini from the LKY School. Alan, as an American, I found a lot of your presentation very, very real, very familiar. Sounds like the cities that I've lived in. But I'm wondering, given that Americans are not very good at learning lessons from other parts of the world, are there any cities within the United States that have coped with this set of problems, that have found ways to reverse these trends? There are some like Manhattan that were already dense for other reasons that didn't go through this. But is there anybody who's actually figured out a solution even on a small scale?
Well, for years I concluded a course I teach on urban politics and land use planning with the case of Portland, Oregon, which has gotten enormous amounts of publicity. And Portland, Oregon, with state legislation and local legislation combined, about 33, 34 years ago, established urban growth boundaries and a series of policies to encourage developers to develop closer in rather than going further out, and indeed prohibiting development beyond the growth boundaries. And then, because support in the Portland area was quite strong for this, they kept refusing to expand the urban growth boundaries as the region grew, and it's grown quite a bit over the years. There have been constant referendums about this. Although it's popular, the opponents, one of the characteristics of American local politics is that in many parts of the country, it's possible for a relatively small number of people to put a question on the ballot, and they phrase the question the way they want to. And then you have an election campaign, and the people vote directly on the question. And so the people who were opposed to this planning came back with referendums based on property rights. That the government is taking away your property rights when it says you can't develop outside these boundaries. You own land, now you're told you can't develop this land. And they've won some of those referendums. So the battle has gone on and on. Well, the answer is there's been some slight increase in the density of Portland, but Portland is only 1/4 the density of Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, with no serious policies to speak of, has become more dense during this same period of time, simply because of the pressures of long-distance commutes, which become intolerable beyond a certain point, and the pressure of the mountains and the sea, which limit the amount of land available for development in the Los Angeles area. So the answer is there's no great success story in the United States. One has to travel the world to find better success stories.
In the back there, and then I'll come back to you here.
Hi, Professor. Thank you. It was a very interesting lecture.
You have to identify yourself.
My name is David Ragsbill. I'm a first-year MPP student at LKY, and I'm from Los Angeles. So, my question is more sort of on urban planning, and you talked a lot about rational planning. What impact do you think Jane Jacobs had in sort of the loss in confidence in rational planning in the United States? Thank you.
Well, it's not as if there was a high confidence in rational planning before Jane Jacobs. Planning has never been a powerful force in the United States. Jane Jacobs contributed some very interesting ideas, which planners and others have taken up and which have been intellectually valuable in the years since. The impact on urban planning has been modest. She's one, of course, she was a particularly important figure intellectually.
Do you want to tell everybody who Jane
Jacobs? Who was Jane Jacobs? Yes. Jane Jacobs was a journalist, not trained at all in urban planning, but who became interested, who was assigned to cover some of the early urban renewal activities in the United States during the 1950s, and who wrote a great book called Death and Life of Large American Cities. It was Life and Death. I forget which came first. And then she wrote another very important book called The Economy of Cities. And she became a great guru around urban issues. But, you know, she was just an intellect in a great world of politics, and so she had, the effects of her work were limited. She had the greatest effect in Lower Manhattan, where she lived at the time, because she helped to mobilize her neighbors and lots of other people in Lower Manhattan to stop highways, to stop major slum clearance projects that were planned in that area. Then she moved to Toronto, where she lived for the last 30 or 35 years of her life, and she had significant impacts in Toronto, but much less impact in the United States than in those two areas.
Okay, this question over there, the young man over there, please. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eng An, and I'm an economics sophomore at NUS. I just have a question about Frank Lloyd Wright's decentralization concept.
Well, who's?
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Frank Lloyd Wright. Yes,
yeah.
Okay.
He argued about going for even lower density and mass auto ownership, but lower use, and also residence-based activities. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, Frank Lloyd Wright was a visionary of the auto-dependent city. Now, of course, his Broadacre City, which was his most famous statement of this, was I think in the 1920s, wasn't it? And it was before we had any chance to see what the full consequences of this would be. It also was in the period when the United States had limitless land, limitless oil. It was producing most of the cars in the world. Nobody had heard of environmental problems. It was an ingenious design idea for a time when nobody was concerned about the problems we're concerned about today. It was never in itself influential in the development of American cities, but it's a landmark in sort of creative intellectual thought around a much larger issue that, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was really able to deal with. I mean, he was able to think in creative design terms about this. He knew people liked cars. He knew people liked to live at low densities. He was right about all of that. He wasn't an urban planner, and he thought much more realistically about buildings than he thought about cities.
Thank you. The back there. Yeah.
My name is Lim Yu Chai. I'm a civil engineer by training, a former academician at a local university. Professor, let me pose a question to you, or rather I would like to ask your comments on this report that was written in the Straits Times of Singapore, dated 29th December 07. US cities take the lead in going green. They offer residents rebates for being environmentally friendly, free hybrid car parking, cash rebates for installing solar panels, low interest loans for energy saving home renovations. I would like to have your comments, please. Thank you.
There are examples of all of these things in the United States. But the United States is a vast continental country with tremendous diversity. Unfortunately, all of these things, if you add them in the aggregate, are not having any significant impact on the total pattern of energy consumption and environmental impact in the United States. But it does indicate that there is some ferment, that in the absence of national leadership, some states and localities are trying to do useful things themselves. In fact, the states and localities are not powerful enough by themselves to really turn around the overall carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emission footprint of the United States, but hopefully they are the precursors of stronger policies to come.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Prof, thank you very much. And I could agree definitely with Kishore's assessment that your wisdom is very, very real. Now, my question here, that coming back to the terms of reference...
My wife is going to make a rebuttal. We'll call her up a little later.
Right, sir. Now, with regard to the terms of reference, my name is Ice from Innovation. I'm just a layperson. Now, my question is that pertaining to one definitive situation, the Silicon Valley, the industrial parks of America, excluding Boston, Texas, and so on, just California, and that is Silicon Valley and Coast Tax. I went to states in 1998, 99, with profound interest in certain dimension. I went by the conventional way in the first trip. I don't think that's the right way. I go in the second way, by way of going through the old LA, takes a Greyhound, see the demographic of America, then do a thorough investigation of reality. And yes, indeed, it's frightening. You look at the poverty level, looking at the undeveloped situation in America, which I think that is very fearful to stay and to live. But yet I have to conquer America and I have to be there. And the question here is that what can we learn from the success and failure of Silicon Valley and Texas Coast in terms, Coast Tech, in terms of what Singapore could learn from Asia, because the next Euro-Asiatic undertaking that I would like to initiate was, bearing in mind, of course, Australia in the background. Now, my question here, yes, sir. The question is that what you think that we should learn that America 50 years ago, starting Silicon Valley, that is yesterday's proposition. How could we move on to the 21st proposition, the dynamisms and so on, and the crucial things that we need to know, that you can enlighten us in a short and, precise definition? Thank you.
How do you replicate Silicon Valley? Well, people all over the United States and the world have been trying to figure that one out. I read recently that the first entrepreneur who developed a computer production firm, it was not a full computer, in Silicon Valley, moved there to be near his mother. There was no plan. There was no plan. It was totally serendipitous in terms of capitalist-driven development. Cities have developed because there are agglomeration economies. When you bring people doing creative things together, the sparks fly, and in the best circumstances, chain reactions get underway, and those chain reactions can lead to extraordinary concentrations of creative, economic, and other kinds of activity. That happened in an extraordinary way in Silicon Valley, and it's still going on, in spite of some of the worst traffic congestion in America, I should say. Silicon Valley is super expensive to live in. It's impossible to get around in, which, by the way, leads people to try to locate the firms closer and closer to one another. Nobody quite knows how to replicate it. People in Boston have been talking about this for years, because Boston and Silicon Valley, there was a Route 128 built, which is a belt around a circumferential highway surrounding Boston, that was a direct competitor of Silicon Valley in the computer industry, and basically lost in the 1980s. Boston has come back in other ways around biotechnology and so on, but it's never regained its competitiveness with Silicon Valley around high-tech computer, electronic high-tech activities. And, there are theories that the Silicon Valley experience, the California laws, were somewhat more favorable to capitalist development than what was going on in Boston. Who can say? I mean, biotechnology is absolutely booming in Boston in the same environment. And again, it wasn't planned. It happens that there are two great universities there, MIT and Harvard, which are just full of great scientists turning out discoveries and companies, and they have formed lots of companies themselves with venture capitalists. Other companies have come in and located their research headquarters there to be near the scientific work that's being done. You can't credit Massachusetts or the city of Boston or the city of Cambridge with any of this. Now the question is, can governments do something to make this happen? I think the answer is yes. They can create favorable environments. They can sometimes make strategic investments of their own. But the greatest success stories, certainly that you can take out of the United States, owe a fairly limited amount to government, except that the United States provides an environment extraordinarily favorable to capitalist development. And lots of people have found a way to come there and create private profit-seeking economic activities within that framework.
Next question. I am going to give somebody else a chance. Please, go ahead. Yeah.
Hello, I'm John. Two comments, Prof. I think you should change the title from Lessons Not to Learn from American Cities to Lessons to Learn but Not to Copy from American Cities. First comment.
By the way, I never was worried that Singapore was going to copy American cities. I was trying to figure out a way that I could say something here in a way that might be of interest.
Because I think from what you have actually painted with all the facts supporting your theory, there's a lot of things we can learn from American cities, but not to copy necessarily. Second comment is one of your questions that you were teasing us is whether Americans can change. I don't think you have really supported the argument very strongly. It's because you skip over it very quickly by talking about the political climate at the moment and some social consciousness coming along. And you hinted that it might even happen this year. My simple, uneducated, unexposed mind tells me it ain't going to happen this year. And I don't think it's going to happen in the US for quite some time to come. That's my own little pet theory. The reason I say that is because I think America and Americans are so blessed that it has become their curse. It's a continent so flow with blessing, natural resources, human intelligence, all this, when you combine all these attributes together, the best political will and the most desired social consciousness can only mitigate the ignoble savage, which is the American. Okay? So my little pet theory tells me that for the next 100 years, possibly, the Americans are not ready for real change. Okay? You've been at it for 200 years, and the Americans, because of your blessing, you have taken a very hardened position. The convergence of that savage is primary problem, not your political will or your social consciousness or whatever else. I think you have to look inside into the American. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, except for your use of the term noble savage and your 100-year time frame, I think there's a lot to what you say. Any country that's blessed with extraordinary natural resources runs the risk of relying on those resources and not fully developing the talent of its people. And so when you're poor in resources, it seems like a terrible thing at the beginning, but in many countries around the world, and this is one of them, it's proven to be a blessing in the end, because it forces you to concentrate on the most fundamental resource you have, which is your people, and on creating an environment in which other people and investors want to come in and work with you to build your economy up. So the United States does face that risk, and doesn't face it as badly as some of the oil-rich countries in the world that really have nothing else going, have no industry, have no serious economy going aside from this, and whose people lose the habit of work and so on. Americans are super hard-working people. There are all kinds of other factors operating in the United States. The United States is not primarily a commodity-based economy. It's not primarily a natural resource-based economy, even though we are blessed with natural resources. But it's also true that we have less imperative to change than lots of other people in the world do. And we have a politics which makes change at the governmental level difficult, even though by leaving the private sector very free, it allows change in the private enterprise world to be very easy. So we have that duality in the United States. But in dealing with these great collective issues, we need collective action. And it's very hard for us to do that in the governmental framework. As for what's going to happen this year, who knows?
Can I take the privilege of being the chairman and asking you the last and in some ways the most difficult question? The amazing thing is that when you talk to the American intelligentsia, they are by far the best informed in the whole world. I mean, it's hard to match American intellectuals in terms of their understanding of what's wrong with the world. Global warming, after all the warnings of global warming come from American intellectuals, come from Tom Friedman, come from Al Gore. And the solutions at the same time seem to be very simple. I mean, if you listen to Al Gore, you listen to Tom Friedman, they say, let's have $1 a gallon tax, and you get rid of half the problems that you cited up there. And yet, at the same time, you said in your talk that when Jimmy Carter proposed the same idea, it sank like a rock in the lake. And even today, no American politician dares to touch $1 a gallon tax. Now, how do you explain this schizophrenia between the wisdom of your intellectuals and the total lack of wisdom of your politicians?
Well, wisdom has to be calibrated to the task before you. And their first task is trying to get elected. And so in that framework, they have a certain degree of wisdom. But if one wants to think more deeply about this, so America is in the midst of an anti-tax fever. I mean, it's very difficult to raise taxes for anything. It used to be that Americans were willing to see the gas tax raised to improve the highways and maybe even mass transit, but as long as you kept it in the surface transportation system. Now it's incredibly difficult to get approval for tax increases even for that. But more generally, there is a deep hostility in the United States to using taxation as a mechanism of social engineering. It's one thing to raise taxes on motorists because you have to pay for the infrastructure that the motorists use. It's another thing to raise taxes because you want to change their behavior. You think there's something wrong with their behavior and you want to change it. And you and I may think there's nothing wrong with that all taxes have influence on behavior, and we would be right. But in fact, when the media get on this, if a politician or a non-politician like Al Gore makes this proposal, the public is ready to respond with the traditional American response, which is, it's not the job of politicians to change the people. You know, Bertolt Brecht is reported to have said during the period of East Germany at one point, the government needs a new people. Americans respond that they don't want a government that thinks it needs a new people. They want the government to serve the people it has. And this makes it fearfully difficult unless Americans become persuaded that there is some great threat. So if you go back to World War II, for example, Americans were mobilized to a remarkable degree. And they did change their behavior because they believed there was a mortal threat to the nation. The energy and environmental issues have not reached that stage yet. What is interesting is that we do have remarkable changes from time to time. During the New Deal, there was the establishment of a significant welfare state. During the World War II I just talked about. During the Johnson administration, before he got into Vietnam, extraordinary advances in social policy and healthcare policy. The environmental movement, which I've talked about before, which has had a remarkable effect on the quality of the air in American cities. One of the things about greenhouse gases is they don't make you sick. If they were making people sick in American cities, we'd have a great movement against them, because we have had such movements in the United States. That's why it hasn't been possible to build a nuclear plant in the United States since the 1970s, because people are so concerned about the risks of possible radiation emissions as well as nuclear waste issues around us. Americans are extraordinarily sensitive to their own health. But how we get so that to the point where the energy and greenhouse gas issues arouse Americans in the same way is going to require a lot of creativity.
Well, it's 6:30. I have good news and bad news for all of you. The good news is that the happy hour is about to begin. We'll have a reception. For those who came late, there'll be a reception in the Space Bank behind us. The bad news is that this has come to the end of your lecture, Alan. But I must say that one of the concrete results that I will take away from this lecture is that it demonstrates clearly why public policy education, this is a commercial again, by the way, why public policy education is very much a sunrise enterprise. Because if you really want to understand many of the problems in the world, you really have to bring together all the dimensions, and you can see how, in this remarkable way, urban policies and geopolitics are connected. And the only place where you can study all these things together, of course, is in the School of Public Policy. So please enroll. Thank you very much, Alan, for the great lecture. Thank you.